Continuing my discussion of prejudice for social psychology. One thing we do have to talk about is whether prejudice has changed over time. There often is this general view of like, oh, in the olden times, you know, a long time ago, prejudice was really bad. It was all over the place. But then we fixed everything and now things are good. And of course, hopefully, if you've been alive and paying attention, you know that is not true. But one thing we do see is that people can become very concerned in times of social change. Perhaps particularly people who have that high authoritarianism or social dominance orientation that we talked about in previous videos. But in general, people get a little uneasy when things start to become different. And so sudden social changes can concern people. All people, even people who, consider themselves progressive or they're fighting for change. It can be a time of uncertainty, certainly. And so, just to give you a sampling, there have been some major changes in the last few decades in the United States. I am teaching in the United States. If you are joining from another country, different specifics may apply to your own country, but a lot of places in modern times have gone through some change. In the United States, same-sex marriage is now legal in the United States. At the time of recording, we got that one from the Supreme Court in, 2015? 2015, fairly recently, we had that change. More women than men now enroll in college. I can still remember when I was in college in the 90s, like all my professors were men, almost all. It was very rare to get a woman as a professor, particularly in scientific fields. And now in my own department, teaching in a psychology department, you see much more of an even spread, even distribution. And so that's just among faculty, but students too. At my own campus, we have more female students than male students. Now, we do collect data in such a way that we force the binary. We do ask as male and female, so we may be missing some data on non-binary students, but that's what the data tells us. And so we also see that we have changes in leadership. Certain ceilings are being broken with women in power, having women and people in minority groups gaining more power or positions of power. They're still in the minority, but you will have those notable visible positions like, that university president has never chosen a woman as chancellor or president before. All the chancellors have been white and now we've got one that is not white. Wow, that's something new, that's different. And so, this is just a sampling of some of the changes that we have seen. Does this mean that prejudice is gone, that we don't have to worry about it? No, of course not. We know that prejudice is still out there. Is discrimination a thing of the past? Well, news reporters wouldn't have a whole lot to report on if there was none whatsoever. And we certainly can find news stories showing that, yeah, that is still happening. So what has happened? Well, the thing is, we have to talk about different types of prejudice to talk about which types have declined and which are still going strong. So first we have to differentiate between old-fashioned prejudice and modern-symbolic prejudice. And so what's old-fashioned prejudice? Old-fashioned prejudice, it was out in the open, nobody tried to hide it. Explicit prejudice. Explicit means it's out in the open, it is not hidden. Nowadays, old-fashioned prejudice is generally less socially acceptable in many places. You might find a friendly group of people to certain ideas where maybe you can say what you want, but there are certain things we know, like if you are the mayor of a city, a town, you're probably not supposed to go on the news and go ahead and say explicit prejudicial ideas. All right, certain things you're not supposed to say out loud. If you have a restaurant, where you have an entrance for white patrons and an entrance for black patrons, nowadays you get put out of business really quick because of the controversy. But very recently, less than 100 years ago, in the United States, there were places where you had separate water fountains, where you had separate entrances. So this old-fashioned prejudice, yeah, we know we're not supposed to say that part out loud at the very least. It's less socially acceptable. We do see that with this obvious, overt, not hidden type of prejudice, we do see that some types of prejudice are more tolerated than others. All right? Here's where I know I'm going to get comments. People are going to call me fat. All right? It happens whenever I put my fat face online. Somebody somewhere will find it and have to point that out. You might not have seen all of them because sometimes I get them deleted or reported depending on what rules they break. All right, so fat phobia. Fat phobia, weight stigma, making fun of people for being overweight, for being fat. A lot of people are like, well, no, that's not prejudice. I'm concerned for their health. It's like, do you have their medical records in front of you? Excuse you. All right, so media portrayals of overweight, obese, or just non-skinny people are still very much rampant. I mean, making someone be the butt of a joke just because their size, anyone who's not like a size, like anyone bigger than a size 2, a US size 2, it's very funny to be like, oh, here, they're overeating because they are so huge. We also see that roles that are meant to be larger people, not only are they often comic relief, or they're the villains, the bad guys, they're the villains, they're the comic relief, but when an acting role exists that's supposed to be for a heavier person, very often we do not hire the fat actors, even though the fat actors are out there ready to work. They hire a skinny actor and put them in a fat suit, or they work with a trainer to gain the weight. And some other folks are like, hey, I've already got the weight. I've already got the body type. Let me audition. And I've had students in class be like, well, no, that's good. You should have fat stigma. You should have fat phobia, because if we didn't have that, that just gives them permission to be fat. That right there, that type of thinking, that exhibits the idea that that's a prejudice. That is a type of prejudice. It is more socially acceptable than other types of prejudice. Now, religious based prejudice. And I've talked previously, all right, being religious does not mean you are prejudiced. There's a whole complexity of issues that come about with studying religion. We have to study religiosity, not religion, and we have to ask extra questions. But when people's religious beliefs are used to back certain types of prejudice, sometimes we see it as more acceptable. Well, no, they're not prejudiced. It's just against their religion. They're technically, yeah, they're discriminating when they don't serve those clients. When that adoption agency doesn't allow same-sex parents to adopt children, yes, technically it's discrimination, but it's based on religion, so that's different. No, that's still discrimination. No matter what your backing is, it's still discrimination. It may be based on prejudice. It's still there, but sometimes it's seen as more socially acceptable. Now, another thing that we see is choice. Whether we see something as being chosen or in the person's control. And this very much ties in with things I've talked about in previous videos, like victim blaming, belief in a just world, internal attributions, having an intrinsic, having an internal locus of control. All right, so if you believe that someone's situation that leads to them being discriminated against, if you believe that they're in control of being in that situation, you are more likely to be tolerant of those prejudice or discrimination that's targeted at those individuals. So for example, weight. Well, if you just weren't fat, if you just went on a diet, you wouldn't be fat, and then nobody would be discriminated against you, so quit whining. All right? Or sexual orientation, gender identity. A lot of people, I don't have time to give this the full treatment that I could, because you could teach a whole class on these relevant topics. All right? But short version, a lot of people believe that if someone comes out as transgender or gender non-conforming, gender fluid, non-binary, or if they are not straight, all right? If they get to be anywhere, well, not anywhere, in the LGBTQ part of the LGBTQ plus community, because, you know, intersex, they may, you know, they may recognize that they don't have a choice. Asexual, anyway, there's lots of letters in the alphabet mafia where people think they have a choice. Well, you don't have to be gay. You don't have to be lesbian. You don't have to be bi. Who told you to identify as pansexual? Who told you you had to be trans? Just stay with what your birth certificate said. All right, again, whole other series of videos could easily be made about these topics. The point is that people see it as a choice. When you see it as a choice, people say, well, just don't identify that way and you won't be discriminated against. So people are more tolerant of that type of prejudice and discrimination because they see it as choice. So some types of prejudice are more acceptable or tolerated than others. Now, old-fashioned prejudice does seem to have decreased over time. So that type, we can say that that type has decreased over time, particularly for the ones that are less tolerated. Most racists are not going to come out and spew their racism in public, all right? They know that they're not supposed to say that out loud. Really explicit sexist ideas, people are like, oh yeah, you're not supposed to say that. That's wrong type of thinking, wrong type of talking. We shouldn't do that out loud anyway. All right, and so old-fashioned prejudice seems to have decreased, but more subtle, not out loud forms of prejudice, they still seem to persist. So then we have to talk about modern symbolic prejudice. And this is the more subtle types, the things where we don't say things out loud and we might not even be realizing that we're acting a certain way, that we are treating people unfairly or thinking of people unfairly. And so people who exhibit modern symbolic prejudice, they claim to value equality. This is where there's a little bit of cluelessness involved. But they also oppose social change. Like, look, I am not racist. I don't approve of racism. Oh, but do they have to move into my neighborhood? You know, that sort of thinking. Like, well, no. I mean, I'm not saying be mean to people that aren't in my group. I'm not saying harm people who are in my out group. Just, I mean, can't everything stay the same? You know, I like change. We're uncomfortable with change. And so, so people who like to think that they value equality, they don't like to think of themselves as prejudiced, as somebody where you can stick an ist, you know, racist, sexist, whatever it may be. But they also at the same time oppose social change that would allow equality because they perceive that it's taking resources away from them, or it just makes them feel uncomfortable because change can be frightening. All right, so what do we see with modern symbolic prejudice? They will convince themselves, or they will try to argue, that most forms of prejudice and discrimination don't exist or are rare. You know, so it's just like, oh no, we don't have racism anymore. We don't. Oh, people used to be really sexist, but oh, thank goodness, we don't have that anymore. I don't see color. Folks, we all see color. If you can see, you see. If you're not colorblind, like literally colorblind, you can see color. All right, that's our sort of thinking just frees you up from having to address color, from having to discuss it. It's uncomfortable to discuss things like racism. All right, and so they also will interpret differenced and inequalities in a way that kind of puts the blame on the person who is in the out-group, who is being treated unfairly. So differences in things like income, differences in access and resources, they're due to lack of effort. They're not due to discrimination, because discrimination doesn't happen. No, it's because they're not trying hard enough. When people speak up, when people try to say, hey, it would be nice if we got treated better, they can shut that down. They can dismiss that. They'll say, well, their anger and their discrimination claims, they're not justified. They're exaggerating. they are making things up. They're just trying to get attention. They're just trying to get money because they're suing somebody. They're just trying to ruin the career of somebody who's getting ahead. You know, it's a lot of things that you engage in to reduce cognitive dissonance, something from a previous video, to make yourself feel more comfortable. They will see that people who are complaining about unequal treatment, they will say that they are seeking special favors rather than just trying to catch up and be equal. They will see that they want more or too much, and they will think that they get more than they deserve. They will hear that, you know, somebody wins a lawsuit, that somebody gets special consideration for admission into a school, and like, well, that's not fair. How come they're getting special treatment? Somebody gets a holiday to commemorate something important to their group. They're like, well, that's not fair. How come we didn't get a holiday? And a lot of times they may not realize they already had them. They were not being discriminated against. They were not lacking, but you often don't see that when you're in that situation. All right, and so one example that the textbook that I use for class, one example that they use is the men's rights movement. You know, the reaction to women's rights, feminism, the reaction is, well, we need a men's rights movement. Or when people say, well, how come there's no straight pride parade? How come there's no white history month? That sort of thinking, that is modern symbolic prejudice. So you're not actively trying to harm the members of the minority or marginalized groups. You just don't want them to be heard. You don't want to acknowledge that any of the unequal treatment is happening, and you worry that they're somehow getting more than you or getting advantageous treatment. You know, like, hey, that's not fair. Why are you paying attention to them and not me? That sort of thinking. All right, so I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video I'm going to talk about different types of prejudice that may not seem harmful, may not seem like prejudice, but they still count.